So antibody drug conjugates are a very interesting class of agents. They're actually monoclonal antibodies that we typically use that are targeted to receptors on cancer cells. But the unique things about these antibody drug conjugates, they have attached to the monoclonal antibody biologically active drugs through chemical linkers, and these allow essentially for that antibody to attach itself to its target in on the cancer cell, and with this linker in place, and ultimately it will deliver and release the cytotoxic agents to the tumor site. So what happens is that you essentially maximize your drug targeting and concentration at the site, at the tumor site, with minimizing essentially the likelihood of systemic exposure and toxicity. At least theoretically, that's what these agents are supposed to do. Now, this is not a new area. At least since 2001, there have been about 100 plus studies that were looking at various antibody drug conjugates. It's a very attractive field. It makes sense. So you have a target, you have a conduit to the target, attach itself to the cell, and then releases the cytotoxic agent into the cell. Now, they do have this potential for cytotoxicity. Now, although they're more specific, they certainly have their own toxicities, which are very typical for the toxicities that relate to the monoclonal antibody itself, but also to the cytotoxic agent, although again, with a lower likelihood. I think overall we expect those agents to be relatively well tolerated. And as I said, because we've worked both with the antibodies and with the cytotoxic agents for most cases, the adverse events are actually quite predictable. Although again, putting the two together may create some additional toxicities that we need to be careful about, and we'll discuss those further. At this stage of development for these monoclonal for these ADC agents, it primarily focused on advanced disease. The role of antibody drug conjugates in more or earlier stages of diseases is a little bit too early in the game, given the fact that we're just starting to see many of these agents showing the promise they do in the later stages. So ultimately, some of these agents will make it to other earlier stages. But at this point of time, these antibody drug conjugates are primarily being looked at in the more advanced setting, and that's how they've been used in clinic at this time. So interstitial lung disease is, or the precursor to that, which is pulmonary damage and pneumonitis that ultimately leads to interstitial lung disease, is something that we have seen in a number of other agents across the last 2 to 3 decades. A lot of the agents actually we've used we continue to use in clinic. These were rare occurrences, and therefore, we rarely have seen them. They amount to about 1 to 2% of all patients treated with either some forms of chemotherapy or even immune therapy agents, specifically PD-1 and PD-L1 inhibitors. So there is some level of understanding among colleagues about the potential risk, but because the risk is low, this is not necessarily high on the radar of physicians. So take, for example, an agent that's commonly used across multiple malignancies, gemcitabine, pancreas cancer, lung cancer most commonly. I mean, although the incidence of this happening is extremely low, at least with our agents that we commonly use in clinic, when it happens, it is quite devastating, and it can be quite devastating for patients, whereby they end up with long-term toxicities to the lung. Many patients may end up disabled and on oxygen, on lifetime oxygen because of these complications. So these are very serious complications when they do occur. In terms of our experience with the development of drug-induced ILD, as I said, in my practice at least, most of what we see is related to the drugs we commonly use, and most of those cases have been seen either with gemcitabine. Seen them in a couple of patients with irinotecan. We've also seen this with patients who receive PD-1 inhibitors such as nivolumab or pembrolizumab. So we've seen it. Again, thankfully, it's rare, but we've seen it. And when I can tell you about the most common drug, at least in my clinic, where I've seen it happen, is with gemcitabine. Let's say maybe one patient a year that experiences ILD. There's nothing to predict it, and there's no timeline. I mean, it can happen at any time the patient is on the drug. The patient can present with symptoms that are, as insidious as just a cough, a dry cough, to significant shortness of breath, and hypooxygenation. Luckily for all these patients that we've had, we've been able to diagnose them early, early meaning before they decompensate completely to the point of no salvage. My experience has been with this that, again, it's irreversible, and for many patients we had to essentially go with put the patient on oxygen, chronic oxygen, with occasional steroids for patients who actually at the beginning stages that had more symptoms. So we've had those patients. Unfortunately, for those patients, again, we have to discontinue the drugs. So overall, this is not a dose-related toxicity, meaning that the drug has to be completely stopped. Dose modifications or what have you will not prevent this from getting worse. So ultimately, the patient needs to discontinue the drug to stop the exposure, and that typically will stop worsening of the symptoms. For most patients, again, this does not reverse. For some, it may, but for most patients, it does not reverse.